There are a number of passages we're going to turn to today. They show up in your bulletin in order. If I'm going to be putting the passages up on the screen, so I would suppose that if you want to follow along and keep up with me in the text in the Bibles, in your own copies of the Bible, begin in Luke chapter 14, verse 26, and then just follow along on the outline from there. But we're working our way through the church's vision, and the idea is to encourage stronger alignment as a church with what we're doing and how we are doing it. And as I introduced the vision last week, I pointed out that our vision is going to include both a mission statement that clarifies what we're doing and strategy points which clarify how we're going to go about doing it. And this is because it's quite common to totally agree on what we're doing, but to completely disagree on the method that we use to do it. And so in order for our vision to be most effective, we're going to clarify both. We're going to put our best effort into doing so. Now, last week, we introduced and explained the mission statement, and I stated my intention to start working through the strategy points this week. However, upon reflection, I feel that there's more that needs to be said on the mission statement itself before we can move on. So we're going to hold off on starting the strategy points until next week, and we're going to look at the mission statement one more time this morning, and hopefully by the end of this you'll be able to see why we need to do that. So here's the mission statement again. Hold on. There we go. Here's the mission statement again. If you guys have your outlines in front of you, go ahead and fill it in. If you don't have outlines and you'd like one, we do have them on the little bistro tables there with the offering plates. Just keep in mind, just grab the one on top there. But those are available for you if you need to follow along and fill in. But our mission statement is, Niagara Alliance Church exists to develop fully invested followers of Jesus who live the life that he lived. Again, Niagara Alliance Church exists to develop fully invested followers of Jesus who live the life that he lived. Let me give you just one more second to follow that in, or to fill that in, and then we'll move on. If you recall, we saw last time that this mission statement is basically an expansion of Jesus' command to make disciples in Matthew 28:19. And so when you look at it that way, we see Niagara Alliance Church exists to develop, that is to say, to make fully invested followers of Jesus who live the life that he lived, or disciples. We're basically just saying make disciples there. We're just expanding the language so we can articulate clearly what we mean by that when we say it. Now, embedded in this statement is a 3-step process to fulfilling it. It's what we're going to call the path to becoming a disciple maker, which is the title of the sermon this morning. So this is what I'm going to talk to you about today. And this morning we're going to clarify these 3 steps. Now, as it turns out, we've already talked about the first 2 in detail last week, so we're not going to develop them in any serious detail today. We're just going to reflect back on them briefly. But we are going to take the opportunity to demonstrate how our current ministry efforts fit in to these first 2 steps so that we can better understand what we're already doing and why we're already doing it. Then we're going to take a deeper dive into the final step, because that's the one that we really need to tie off. We didn't really get a chance to cover it last week. And with all that said, here are the 3 steps to fulfilling our mission statement. This is the path to becoming a disciple maker. First, the first step is discovery. Discovery, what we mean by discovery is learning what a true disciple of Jesus actually is, learning what a true disciple of Jesus actually looks like. We simply can't make disciples of the world around us without first being clear on what a true disciple of Jesus actually looks like. And that's why we vested quite a bit of real estate in describing a disciple in our mission statement. I know that you already have that in front of you, and that mission statement says, again, it describes a disciple as a fully invested follower of Jesus who lives the life that he lived. We invested that real estate, we put that description in there to describe what we mean when we say make disciples, okay? Now, we went into detail on how we came to this definition of a disciple last week, so go back and check it out, the message last week, for the full explanation. It's on the website, and it's also on our YouTube channel. But here are the main passages that we looked at last week, which describe what a true disciple looks like, okay? The first one is Luke chapter 14, verses 26 and 27. If anyone comes to me and does not hate his own father, mother, wife, children, brothers, sisters, yes, and even his own life, he cannot be my disciple. Whomever does not carry his own cross and come after me cannot be my disciple. Jesus is basically saying here that a true disciple is fully invested in following him. He's following him with more than his words. He's doing more than checking the box. He's fully investing his life in the pursuit. So there's that. But there's also 1 John chapter 2 and verse 6, which says this: "The one who says that he remains in him ought himself also walk just as he walked." The one who says that he remains in him ought also himself to walk just as he walked. John was basically saying here that a true disciple of Jesus emulates him. A true disciple lives the life that he lived. Now, to be clear by this text is not saying that you're not a disciple until you're perfect like Jesus. If it said that, it would be impossible to achieve. What it's saying is that a true disciple progressively becomes more like Jesus day by day. In other words, if the deeds of the flesh are what's increasing in a person's life and not the fruit of the Spirit, then they're not actually following Jesus regardless of how personally invested they might be in him. They're not following him if the fruit of the Spirit isn't gradually progressing and manifesting in their life. Again, it's not saying that true disciples have to be perfect, but it is saying that true disciples are headed towards Christ's perfection and not away from it. Does that make sense? They're headed in that direction, and the fruit of the Spirit is manifesting in an increasing way. Now, because this first step in the process is about learning what a disciple is, it is the teaching ministries of the church that most encourage it. Teaching facilitates discovery. Makes sense. And at Niagara Alliance Church, teaching, the primary ministries that teaching happens are here on Sunday morning and also Sunday evening with breakout. The purpose of both of those ministries are to dig into the scriptures and to learn about what it means to be a follower of Jesus. This type of activity is essential to becoming everything that God has called us to be. However, question for you: is it possible that believers can spend all of their time in Bible studies learning about what it means to be a follower of Jesus Christ and do absolutely nothing with that information? What do you think? Yeah. And I've heard the label before, pew potato. I think it's Pastor Mark. That I like it. It's kind of funny. But the idea is you take the information in, you're in the pew, you're taking the information in, but you're not doing anything with it. It's actually quite an accurate label here. The infusion of information is an essential part of becoming a disciple maker. But if we stop here and we do absolutely nothing else, then we become like the Dead Sea. We're basically ever receiving, we're never giving, and in the end, we're spiritually lifeless. And there are so many churches out there today, and believe it or not, more of the churches that are out there today around us are in decline than are growing. Lots of churches, more of them are declining than growing. But all of the churches, even the declining ones, have one thing in common. And would you believe me if I told you what it was? They all have Bible studies. All of them. Even the ones that are in decline, they all have Bible studies. Generally, Bible studies are the first thing that churches do. My first church, it was Spartansburg Alliance Church. It was near Corey, Pennsylvania, in the Western PA district. The church I took over there once had 150 people in attendance every Sunday morning. And this was quite a bit for a small country church that I was in there. That was kind of like a mega church for that area. But when I took it over in 2007, it had 25 people coming on a given Sunday morning, just about 25 there. It had absolutely no rapport with their community. They did nothing to connect with their neighbors and to bless their lives. They hadn't seen a visitor in years, let alone a conversion or a baptism. But you know what they did every week, 3 times religiously? They had Bible studies. Bible studies. They had a Bible study on Sunday morning, they had another one on Sunday evening, and they had another one on Wednesday night, followed by prayer. And they'd been following the same routine for decades, and meanwhile the church was continuing to die around them, week after week, month after month, and year after year. Now, to be clear, I'm not saying this to put down Bible studies. Do you hear me? I'm not saying this to put down Bible studies. Again, like I said before, learning, receiving, discovering is an essential part of making disciples. We can't make disciples without Bible studies. We can't make disciples without discovery. But if that's all we do as believers, if all we do is study the Bible and nothing more, then we will slowly rot inside spiritually. It's true. We will just slowly rot. Churches in decline today are not in that condition due to lack of Bible study generally. It's because that's all they do is Bible study and nothing more. That's why. With this in mind, part of our mission at Niagara Alliance Church is to maintain our Bible studies and to do them well and look for ways to improve them. But we also intend to move beyond them and do those other things that are required to becoming disciple makers. And that moves us on to the second step, which is application. Application, okay? We must apply all that we've learned in our Bible studies into our own lives. We must move everything that we've learned from the theoretical to the practical. We must do more than just merely learn what a true disciple is. We have to become one ourselves. That's what we mean by application here. And why is this so important? It's because we reproduce what we are. We reproduce what we are. We don't reproduce what we desire others to be or what we think we are. We reproduce what we actually are. We can't make disciples of others without first being one ourselves. And we talked about this last week. Probably you remember that. We have to be one to make one. Remember what Jesus said in Matthew chapter 7. So, every good tree bears good fruit, but the bad tree bears bad fruit. A good tree cannot bear bad fruit, nor can a bad tree bear good fruit. Again, bad trees don't bear bad good fruit, and false disciples don't produce true disciples. It's as simple as that. That's what he's saying there. And this is why Paul said to the Corinthians in 1 Corinthians 11:1, "Be imitators of me, just as I also am of Christ." Paul understood that his ability to make true disciples of Jesus was directly connected to how closely he was emulating him personally. He wasn't able to make disciples any better than he was following him. So we must be disciples to make disciples. We must always be assimilating Christ's character into our own lives and becoming more like him. Otherwise, we won't make true disciples. We're going to make false disciples. And again, we covered this in more detail last week, so if you want to go back and check it out for the full explanation. But the second step in the path to becoming a disciple maker is application. It's application. We must not only be continually learning God's truth, we must also be continually applying God's truth to our own lives. And this reality is what's behind the sermon-based small group ministry that we started last year. Our goal with that was to put concentrated effort into applying the truth that we're learning on Sunday morning. Our sermon-based small groups are not Bible studies. Many have noted this. They're not Bible studies, and they weren't designed to be Bible studies. Again, we have nothing against Bible studies, and we're not saying there's anything wrong with having Bible studies, but we already have great Bible studies happening in our church in several different places. And with this in mind, the path forward to becoming a disciple-making church isn't necessarily to add more Bible studies at this point. The path forward is to apply what we're learning, and this is the purpose of the small groups that we started. It's to apply what's being taught. The purpose is to move the information that we're already being presented with and already receiving past the theoretical and into the practical. It's not enough just to learn. We must also apply what we're learning. And small groups provide a perfect environment for this to happen. In small groups, we have other people to process through the ideas with and to encourage one another and to hold each other accountable to growing and to changing, to processing and to applying the truth. Is it a step out of our comfort zone? Is it easier to come and sit and listen and go home? Yeah, it's a step out of our comfort zone to move beyond that and get into a small group. But I would argue that it's essential to becoming a disciple maker. We have to apply, and we have to get closer to the body, and we have to be challenged and hold each other accountable to be able to apply things properly. So if you're not yet in a small group, you have a fantastic opportunity to take that next step towards becoming a disciple maker. We've already got 3 small groups happening on Wednesday evening, one led by Pastor Mark, another by Val Matuskowitz, and one led by Stephanie Toohey. Now, you'll have to talk to each one of them. I'm pretty sure Stephanie's is pretty full. You have to check with her. But Pastor Mark's and Val's may have room. Again, I'm not 100% sure. Check with them. But also, there is a new small group launching on November 11th. I'm going to be leading that one, and I know there's room there. Also, there's Nick and Debbie Geschwinder, who I'm pointing to in the back. They're waving their hands. They are also available Sunday evening to start a small group, and so we're looking to hopefully launch one at that time. There's plenty of opportunity to get on board with this, but becoming a disciple maker involves both learning what it means to be a follower of Jesus and applying that information to our lives. But believe it or not, it doesn't stop there either. It doesn't stop there either. If we stop here, we still stop short of the goal. There's still one more step that we must take, and we're going to spend the remainder of our time together this morning talking about that last step in detail. Because again, we didn't really get a chance to cover it last week. So the final step is reproduction. Reproduction. This is the final step. Simply put, reproduction is active engagement in other people's lives for the purpose of developing them into followers of Jesus Christ. We're actively engaging their lives to develop them. Now, essential to this is the understanding that reproduction, spiritual reproduction, doesn't happen on its own. Merely putting effort into being a disciple of Christ ourselves will not automatically result in the making of disciples in other people. Just being it ourselves, focusing on that, won't result in reproduction. Intentional and focused effort must come on our part for this to happen. And regarding our mission statement, this is what we mean by the word develop, okay? Going back to the mission statement, Niagara Alliance Church exists to develop fully invested followers of Jesus who live the life that he lived. Note that we didn't put learn or teach in that spot. Niagara Alliance Church doesn't exist to merely learn or to teach others what true disciples look like. That's not why we're here. Also note that we didn't put be in that spot. And Niagara Alliance Church doesn't exist to merely be disciples of Jesus ourselves. The word placed there is develop, and it's placed there for a reason, because Niagara Alliance Church exists to develop, that is to say, to actively and intentionally reproduce true discipleship in other people. We exist to make disciples, and this doesn't happen on its own. We have to be intentional about it. We have to apply ourselves to it. Now, last time, for the sake, for one last time, to be absolutely clear on this, learning and being are not bad things. In fact, they are essential to disciple making. If we attempt to pass over these things and jump right into active disciple making, we're not going to make true disciples. We're going to make something different. If we try to skip over learning and being and just go right into doing, we're going to miss something. And we have plenty of examples of that around us. We see it all the time. There are Jehovah's Witnesses and there are Mormons out there. And they sometimes can be, and I know that we disagree with them for good reason, but in some ways you can be inspired by them, right? Because they're out there knocking on doors and they're getting things done, Sometimes we can look at them and say, boy, their theology's bad, but their initiative's good. So they're out there making disciples, but are they making true disciples of Jesus? No, they're not. And why? It's because they've skipped the learning and the being, and they've jumped right into the doing. They don't understand Jesus. They don't understand what being a disciple of Jesus is, and they haven't assimilated that correctly themselves, yet they're going out and making disciples, and so they're making wrong disciples, false disciples. We must correctly learn what true disciples are and apply those truths to our own lives in order to successfully make disciples of other people. However, even if we get the learning right, or even the learning and the being right, but we go no further, then we still fail to make true disciples. And declining churches are an example of that. Just as the cultish churches fail by skipping over learning and being, declining churches all across our country, and probably in the world as well, are also failing by getting the first two steps right. They learn and they apply, but they stop short of reproduction. They don't put intentional effort into going and making disciples of other people. We must carry the process through to the final step and develop it in other people. We can't stop short of reproduction, and to do so would be to fail in our mission. Now, we don't have to look very hard at the Gospels to see that Jesus actively developed disciples in his earthly ministry. He didn't wait around for this to happen on its own, but what's most interesting to us for the remainder of this study is the way that he went about doing it. It's interesting to look at the way that he did it. Because understanding how Jesus made disciples sets the stage for the strategy points that we're going to begin presenting next week. How Niagara Alliance Church intends to go about making disciples as a church is based upon how Jesus did it in his earthly ministry. So you can think of our strategy points as a fuller and more detailed explanation of Jesus' method for making disciples, just as our mission statement is basically a fuller and more detailed explanation of Jesus' command to make disciples. The mission statement is kind of an expansion of the command to articulate what we mean specifically by it. The strategy points that I'm going to begin producing next week are going to be an expansion of Jesus' method as we see it in the gospel, to be very clear about what we mean by it, okay? The strategy points of our vision are rooted in Jesus' strategy for making disciples in his earthly ministry. Now, I suppose that a list of Jesus' strategy points would vary from person to person. I'm sure that we could sit down and you'd have it approached a little bit differently there. However, when I look at the Gospels and I really boil it down, Jesus' method for making disciples, as I look at the way that he did it, there seems to be 3 methods in particular that stand out as you look at all the accounts and boil them together. So here they are, all right? First, Jesus met his disciples where they were spiritually. Excuse me. There we are. Jesus met his disciples where they were spiritually. He met them where they were. Jesus never expected people to clean up their act and come to him before he would enter into a disciple-making relationship with them. Rather, he went to them in the midst of their sinful and broken state as they were. He went to them in that state, and he initiated the process of pouring into their lives. He didn't wait for them to come to him. He didn't wait for them to clean up their act. He went to them as they were. He intermingled with them where they were, and he initiated the process. And one of the clearest examples of this that we see in the Gospels is in the call of Matthew, or Levi, the tax collector. I'm going to give you the text now. It's Matthew chapter 5, verses 27 through 32. I'm going to throw it up on the board for you. After that, he went out and looked at a tax collector named Levi sitting in the tax office, and he said to him, "Follow me." And he left everything behind and got up and began following him. And Levi gave a big reception for him in his house, and there was a large crowd of tax collectors and other people who were reclining at the table with them. The Pharisees and their scribes began grumbling to his disciples, saying, "Why do you eat and drink with tax collectors and sinners?" And Jesus answered and said to them, "It is not those who are healthy who need a physician, but those who are sick. I have not come to call the righteous to repentance, but sinners." So, before becoming Jesus' disciple, Matthew was a tax collector. And this profession was regarded by the Jews at that time as one of the most sinful things that a person could possibly be doing. Tax collectors were considered to be basically traitors by their nation who worked against God's people on behalf of the Roman government and who got rich by defrauding God's people. And note that when the religious leaders called the tax collectors sinners in verse 30, Jesus didn't disagree. He didn't argue the point with them. He didn't say, "Oh, no, don't put that." He seemed to acknowledge that they were. Nonetheless, Jesus reached out to Matthew where he was as a tax collector, and he began his relationship with Matthew in that state. And the religious leaders criticized Jesus for this. They argued that engaging with the people as they were was basically condoning their sin, that he shouldn't even be in the room with them. But Jesus replied that meeting people where they were was key to guiding them out of their sin, hence the illustration in verse 31, which was already up on the board. It is not those who are healthy who need a physician, but those who are sick. In other words, the whole point of being a doctor is to treat sick people. So to wait for the sick to recover before they even come to the hospital is to completely miss the point. See what he's saying there? It completely misses the point. So the first method Jesus used to make disciples was to meet them where they were spiritually. He went right to the places where the sinners were, and he initiated disciple-making relationships there. The religious establishment were always disgusted with him for this, and they argued that his actions condoned sin. There was always a rub there for that. But in reality, Jesus was the only one who was really making a difference in people's lives. The religious leaders had been there for ages, and they had been ministering, and they were completely removed. They were not affecting people by and large. But Jesus was, because he was going into where they were. In the same way today, we can waste our spiritual influence boycotting various things. We can boycott restaurants because they serve alcohol, or we can boycott clothing lines or theme parks because they endorse same-sex marriage, or we can focus on getting into people's lives where they are, sin and all. And we can really not care that much what anyone else thinks of us for doing that. And through the disciple-making relationships that we form with these people, we can impart Christ, and we can impart his victory over sin, and we can make a real difference in people's lives in the process. Again, by getting in there with them. So that's the first method. The second method Jesus used to make disciples is that he taught them by personal example. He taught them by personal example. Jesus was a do as I do type of a leader. He was not merely a do as I say type of a leader. Even in his most radical of commands, he never asked his followers to do anything that he wasn't already doing himself. He lived out what he taught. And the clearest example of this is seen in John chapter 13, beginning in verse 3. And I know the outline says 5 only, but go back to verse 3 for good measure. Jesus, knowing that the Father had handed all things over to him, and that he had come forth from God, and that he was going back to God, got up from the supper and laid his outer garments aside, and he took a towel and tied it around himself. And this is verse 12. I left a verse out there, didn't I? All right, I'm going to give it to you off my notes here. He got up from the supper and laid his outer garments aside, and he took a towel and tied it around himself. Then he poured water into the basin and began washing the disciples' feet and wiping them with the towel which he had tied around his waist. Sorry about that. Then, in verse 12, when he had washed their feet and taken his garments and reclined at the table again, he said to them, "Do you know what I have done for you? You call me teacher and Lord, and you are correct, for so I am. So if I, the Lord and the teacher, washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet, for I gave you an example so you also would do just as I did for you." So he did it. He left the example for them to follow. And Jesus was making the point that following him was not a life of glory and honor. It was a life of servitude, and it was a life of sacrifice. And he made this point by taking the lowliest servant's job in that room. He washed their feet. Jesus didn't merely say, "Following me means being a servant." He didn't stop there and merely say it. He said basically, this is what being a servant looks like. He lived out what he was teaching in front of them so they could see what it looks like. And that's huge. It's different. Seeing someone live out what they teach can be a very, very inspiring thing. I'm sure there's lots of examples that you can think of people that inspired you by living out what they teach. But one example that comes to my mind that I've shared before is when I was in Army basic training. One of my drill sergeants there said, early on in my time in Army basic training, he said to the whole platoon, he said, "I want your boots shined so that I can see my face in them tomorrow morning." And we're all new. We're trying to figure this process out. We don't even know how to shine boots that well. So when they said, "I want them my face to shine in them," we're like, "Oh, we're in big trouble now. We can't do it." But then he gathered us all around, and he started taking some of the soldiers' boots. He didn't take mine, but he took a good many of the people in the room. And he took one of their boots out of their hand, and he'd sit there for a minute with a can of Kiwi shoe polish and some water, and he'd go over it real quick, and within about a minute and a half, 2 minutes, he'd have a sparkling spit shine on the tip of the boot. He'd hand it back to the soldier, and he'd say, "Go now and make the other boot look like this one." And he did that over and over and over again. And I can just remember how amazed I was to see that done. I didn't even think it was possible. He did it in a couple of minutes, and I was looking. I could see my own face in the boot. So I was inspired, and other soldiers were inspired as well. And interestingly enough, that experience was one of the most memorable experiences of basic training. I remember that like it was yesterday, even though it was 25 years ago now, which dates me a little bit. But the reason I share this is that's the power of living out what you teach. When you do more than say it, when you do it in front of them, it's more memorable, and it's more influential, and it's more inspiring, and people have a tendency to remember it that way. Jesus made disciples that way. On the flip side, there are a few things that are more repulsive than hypocrisy, right? There are a few things more repulsive than saying you should do something and then not doing it. That turns people off. There's no better way to turn people off to your message than to teach a standard and not to live it out yourself. This is why it's so important to be the disciples that we're trying to make. True disciple makers practice what they preach, okay? Last one. The last method. Jesus invested in his disciples at the expense of his worldly success. Jesus invested in his disciples at the expense of his worldly success. And this is a very interesting one. So I'm going to develop it with a few more scriptures for you. But throughout Jesus' earthly ministry, there were two main groups of people following him. There were the crowds that thronged after him, and there were the 12 disciples that Jesus chose from among them. Now, for those of you, for those of you familiar with the discipleship pathway, I'm looking for the table where it is. It's here somewhere. But for those of you who are familiar with the discipleship pathway, you know that it's over there. Okay, it's there's 4 categories. So I know I'm oversimplifying here, but for the sake of this teaching time, it's easier to remember it that way. There's the crowds, and then there's the 12. But we see this dynamic broken down that way in Luke chapter 6. So follow along with me. This is Luke chapter 6, verses 12 through 19. Now it was at that time that he went off to the mountain to pray. And he spent the whole night in prayer with God. And when day came, he called his disciples to him and chose 12 of them, whom he also named as apostles. Simon, whom he also called Peter, and his brother Andrew, and James and John, and Philip and Bartholomew, and Matthew and Thomas, James the son of Alphaeus, and Simon, who was called the Zealot, Judas the son of James, and Judas Iscariot, who became a traitor. And then Jesus came down with them and stood on a level place, and there was a large crowd of his disciples, and a great multitude of the people from all Judea and Jerusalem, and the coastal region of Tyre and Sidon, who had come to hear him and to be healed of their diseases, and those who were troubled by unclean spirits were being cured. And all the people were trying to touch him, because power was coming from him, and he was healing them all. So you have two groups of people here, the disciples whom he called out of the crowds, and the crowds themselves. There is a notable difference in the goals of these two groups, if you look at it. The huge crowds that were thronging after Jesus generally sought to receive Jesus' ministry. They sought to receive his healings and his miracles and such things as that. But the small handful of disciples that he chose were learning how to minister alongside of Jesus. So you have the crowds that are receiving, and you have the disciples who are learning from Jesus how to minister to the crowds. There's also a significant difference in which group of people were associated with success, depending upon who we're looking at here. The world around generally viewed the huge crowds that were following Jesus as a sign of his success. Again, the world around saw the crowds and they associated it with success for Jesus. And this is why his brothers urged him to go to Judea and display his miracles in John chapter 7. I'm just giving you one example, but this is John. This is Jesus' brother speaking to him. It says, now the feast of the Jews, the Feast of Booths, was near. So his brother said to him, move on from here and go into Judea, so that your disciples may also see your works which you're doing. For no one does anything in secret when he himself is striving to be known publicly. If you're doing these things, show yourself to the world. You see what he's saying here? They're basically saying here, you're not going to be successful by laying low here. You need to get out there where the people are, and you need to cultivate crowds. You need to do things to cultivate crowds. That's basically what they're saying here. You're not going to be successful if you stay home. There's all kinds of people here. Get out in the middle of it, do some miracles, cultivate some crowds. And so they associated crowds with success. And this is also why the chief priests and religious leaders were always envious of him. It says in Mark chapter 15, verse 10, that ultimately the chief priests and religious leaders handed Jesus over because they were envious of him. They were constantly envious of him because of all the crowds that were always following him. But Jesus himself didn't view crowds as success. In fact, he was generally pulling away from the crowds every chance that he could get. Jesus viewed success in a different way. He viewed success in terms of the handful of disciples that he made. And we actually see this clearly in John chapter 17. So I'm going to give you John chapter 17, verse 4, also verses 6 through 8, okay? This is Jesus praying to the Father before he went to the cross. And he said, I glorified you on the earth by accomplishing the work which you have given me to do. You notice that statement there. I glorified you by accomplishing the work. I finished the job. Would you guys agree that's what he's saying there? I've accomplished it. And in verse 6, he begins to describe what that job was. I have revealed your name to the men whom you gave me out of the world. They were yours, and you gave them to me, and they have followed your word. Now they have come to know that everything which you have given me is from you. For the words which you have gave me, I have given them, and they have received them, and truly understood that I came forth from you, and they believe that you sent me. He's talking about the way that he's invested in his disciples. And he's talking about that in terms of accomplishing his mission. He's not talking about all these crowds that followed him. He's talking about achieving his mission through the disciples that followed him, the smaller groups. For this reason, Jesus consistently looked for opportunities to withdraw from the crowds so that he could personally invest as much time as possible in his small handful of disciples. And so pouring into the 12 was what mattered most to Jesus. and he regularly avoided crowds to do it. Now, that's not to say that he hated the crowds or wouldn't pay attention to them. He clearly loved them, and he ministered to them when they needed it. But throughout the New Testament, I could throw a ton of verses up here to show you that he had a pattern of pulling back from the crowds. He even had a pattern of telling people, don't tell anyone that I did this miracle on purpose so that people wouldn't go and draw crowds to him. He tried to diminish it so that he had more time to focus upon his disciples. And making disciples today requires that as a church we adopt the same mentality. We have to continually ask ourselves the question, are our ministry efforts designed to pack the house with as many people as possible on Sunday morning? Or are our ministry efforts designed to invest quality time and energy into the people that we have and into fewer people? Another way to look at it is, are we trying to get tons and tons of people in here, or are we trying to do a quality job of investing into the lives of people that we have? It's great to have more people, but if we're not doing a good job investing in the lives of the people that we have, maybe we don't need more people right now. Maybe we need to focus on doing the job that we have well first. That's the question that we need to ask ourselves. People still measure ministry success in terms of big crowds today, but Jesus didn't measure success that way at all. For him, it was quality over quantity. And just real quick, I would mention that in my own life personally, the most influential growth in my life, the biggest leaps and bounds that I made in spiritual growth over the years have been the result of a person or two taking time out of their busy life and busy schedule to pump and invest one-on-one energy into me. In particular, there's a pastor back in the Western PA district who, back when I was feeling called to ministry, took me under his wing, even though I had rough edges and a big mouth back then. And he met with me he spent hours with me every week. After every Bible study, I'd come up afterwards. He'd take me to his office. I'd ask him questions, and he'd answer them for me and help me to work through some of the theological issues that I had. Eventually, he started bringing me to all of his visitations, to his board meetings, and he showed me how to pastor a church. He helped me to get licensed, and he helped me to get into my first church. And he did this over the course of 2 years. And the transformation that happened in my life as a result of that was tremendous. And I'd been listening to people teach on the radio, and there'd been all kinds of great teaching that I'd heard, but nothing really had the transforming effect upon me as that one-on-one discipleship type of relationship. And I've had a few relationships like that over the years. Those are the things that really make a difference. And those are the things that we need to be cultivating in this church to take it across the finish line towards reproduction. So, in conclusion, here's the mission statement again, one last time. Niagara Alliance Church exists to develop fully invested followers of Jesus who live the life that he lived. As a church, everything that we are doing is designed to encourage the 3 steps of disciple making that we talked about this morning towards that progression. We're encouraging all of those things. Regarding discovery, we're encouraging Bible study, and we're working on doing it better and improving it. Regarding application, we're pumping energy into sermon-based small groups and in applying the things that are already going. And regarding reproduction, not only are we focusing and acknowledging the need for it, there are some efforts that are already beginning on that. Pastor Mark started the core groups, and that's what the core groups are about right now. Some of you are already in them. Those are about more mature believers pumping energy into other people that want to grow when one-on-one type of relationships that help bring them along. And so we've got a long way to go as a church, but we're heading in the right direction, and we're going to keep doing that. And so I hope that you're able to see what we're doing and why. And with that said, would you pray with me? And let's ask God to help us in our pursuit. Father, we recognize that you set an incredible example for us with Jesus in the way that he came to earth and he made disciples and he laid the foundations for the church. And we pray that we would be able to follow his example as a body here in this little town of Wheatfield in Pennsylvania. We pray that you'd fill us with your spirit and that you'd give us wisdom, that you'd help us to come together and focus on the goal of making disciples by learning and applying and reproducing in others. We ask these things in Jesus' name.